The city hummed behind the glass, but inside, the office was dead silent. Daniel stood by the window, watching the streetlights flicker below while Victoria paced the length of the linoleum floor. The room held nothing but a single desk, a cold operating table, and the crushing weight of their combined student debt. Every shadow in the corner seemed to echo the uncertainty of their gamble. They had traded stable positions for this bare, hollow space, and the lack of equipment felt like a physical absence. Victoria stopped walking, her heels clicking once against the floor before the silence swallowed the sound. She traced a finger along the edge of the operating table, testing its stability. It was solid. It was theirs. Daniel turned from the glass, his presence filling the small space. They looked at the empty walls, then back at each other. The pressure was not just in the ledger or the bank balance, but in the decision they had just made to start here, from nothing. They were far from the security their peers had chosen, but the lack of distractions left them with only one path forward. Daniel reached out, rested his hand on the table, and nodded. The work began now. They cleared the desk of everything except a stack of blank paper and a single, heavy pen. The streetlights outside shifted, casting long, moving bars of light across the room as the night deepened. Daniel pulled a chair close, his movements deliberate, while Victoria laid out the initial projections. They did not talk about next month or next year. They mapped the next 3 decades. Every line they drew on the paper represented a milestone that had to exist before they could even consider a personal draw from the profits. They debated the trade-offs, weighing the immediate comfort of a higher salary against the necessity of building an infrastructure that could survive them. The temptation of a lighter load was always present, hovering in the corners of the room, but they dismissed it with every calculation. They were not just planning a business, they were architecting a legacy. By the time the pen stopped moving, the page was covered in a web of requirements, reinvestment targets, and growth phases. They looked at the finished blueprint, the ink still wet, and the room felt different. The uncertainty that had filled the space an hour ago had been replaced by the quiet, heavy weight of a shared destiny. They knew exactly what the next 30 years would demand, and they had already agreed to pay it. The plan became their reality, and every dollar earned was immediately redirected. While their peers began appearing in new luxury vehicles and tailored silhouettes, Daniel and Victoria remained in the clinic, surrounded by the hum of older, slower machines. They tracked their finances with a cold, unrelenting focus. A surplus did not mean a bonus. It meant a new diagnostic module. They spent their evenings in the cold light of the office, comparing catalogs of surgical hardware against their current revenue streams. The contrast was sharp. One week, they heard about a friend purchasing a high-end sports car, a symbol of professional arrival. The next day, Daniel sat in the office, his hands stained with grease, recalibrating a refurbished centrifuge to squeeze out more efficiency. They were isolating themselves by choice, turning their backs on the visible markers of success to feed the clinic's growth. Victoria handled the final wire transfer for a high-precision laser system, the cost equivalent to a year of luxury living. She watched the balance drop to near zero, then turned back to the operating table. They were not building a lifestyle. They were building a machine that could perform miracles. Every sacrifice was a brick in the foundation, and they were adding as many as the ledger would allow. Their reputation grew, but their lives remained stubbornly static. Word of their success spread through the medical community, yet they stayed in the same modest apartment, driving the same older vehicle. Friends began to notice. At dinner, the questions were pointed. They asked why 2 professionals at the top of their field lived like interns. They suggested that success was meant to be enjoyed, not hidden behind spreadsheets. Daniel listened, his expression neutral, while he poured water into thin glasses. He did not defend their bank account. He let the silence linger until the conversation turned awkward. Then, Victoria stepped in. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. She did not talk about the future in abstract terms. She spoke of the new diagnostic machine in the corner of their clinic. She described the precision it provided and the lives it had already measured. She turned back to the table, her gaze fixed on her guests. She said, "We are not here to look wealthy. We are here to create a foundation." The room went quiet. She did not raise her voice, yet the finality in her tone ended the debate. They were not interested in the appearance of success. They were busy securing the structural integrity of their life's work. The first clinic was no longer a destination. It was a blueprint, Daniel and Victoria bypassed the standard celebratory period and immediately secured a lease for a second location across the city. The transition was brutal. They spent their days balancing patient care with the frantic logistics of construction and staff acquisition. There were no weekends, no holidays, and no pauses. They operated on a cycle of exhaustion, moving from the first clinic to the second, their schedules dictated by the needs of the new facility. When the second site stabilized, they did not stop to breathe. They opened the third. The scale of their operation shifted. They were no longer just practitioners. They were architects of a growing system. Every morning started before dawn, checking reports from 3 separate locations while the city was still dark. By midday, they were navigating between sites, their car serving as a mobile office. They worked until their eyes burned and their hands shook, yet they refused to delegate the core decisions. They personally vetted every new hire and calibrated every piece of equipment. The weight of the mission grew with every square foot of new space, but they kept moving, driven by the knowledge that the foundation required their constant, physical presence to hold. The consultant sat at the head of the heavy oak table, his laptop open to a sprawling spreadsheet. He tapped a finger against the screen, highlighting the column reserved for personal dividends. It was empty. He looked up at Daniel and Victoria, his brow furrowed in genuine confusion. He pointed out that they were currently managing a massive, profitable operation, yet their personal accounts remained stagnant. He argued that their current strategy was fiscally irresponsible, suggesting they take a significant percentage of the quarterly earnings as personal profit. He spoke of market trends, luxury investments, and the importance of reaping the rewards while the business was at its peak. The room felt suddenly small, the air thick with the weight of his logic. Daniel did not look at the screen. He kept his eyes fixed on the ledger, his hand resting flat against the paper. He leaned forward, the chair creaking under his weight. He said, "You are looking at the numbers for this year, we are not." He pushed the ledger back toward the consultant. He explained that they were not building for today, nor for the comfort of the current market. They were building for the next generation. The consultant fell silent, the pen in his hand hovering over his notes, unable to reconcile their vision with his own standard metrics of success. By their 40s, the map on the office wall was no longer just a local chart. It was a web of pins stretching across the entire country. Hundreds of employees now walked the halls of facilities that carried their name, each site a mirror of the original vision. Daniel stood by the window, watching the city lights, while Victoria reviewed a report detailing thousands of successful patient outcomes from the last quarter alone. The scale of the reality finally settled in. They were no longer just running a clinic. They were operating a national institution. They walked through the corridors of their flagship facility at midnight, the silence heavy with the weight of their reach. Every door they passed represented a life touched, a system refined, and a standard set. It was a moment of profound, quiet triumph. They had built something that functioned beyond their own immediate presence. They stepped into the central archives, where rows of digital servers held the collective data of their reach. It was vast, complex, and entirely of their own making. They looked at each other in the dim light of the terminal, the sheer magnitude of the empire finally sinking in. The work had not just grown. It had become a permanent part of the national landscape. The heavy front door clicked shut, sealing out the noise of the city. It was well past midnight. The living room was dark, save for a single lamp casting a pool of light over the dining table. Their daughter sat there, a stack of books pushed aside, her eyes tracking them as they entered. She did not ask about the business or the national reach. She asked why they were never present. She asked why they still pushed themselves until their hands shook and their eyes went dim with exhaustion. Daniel stopped, his keys still in his palm. Victoria walked to the table and pulled out a chair. She did not defend the schedule or cite the importance of the clinics. Instead, she placed her hand flat on the wood, covering the space where her daughter's notebook lay. She looked at her daughter and spoke with a calm, steady rhythm. She explained that the hours were not spent for their own gain. They were not building for today, nor for the comfort of their own lives. They were building a foundation for her, and for the thousands of people who would walk the path they had cleared. The house went quiet. The weight of the last 30 years shifted, transforming from a relentless grind into a deliberate, final act of provision. The daughter looked at her parents, seeing the exhaustion for what it truly was, a sacrifice for a future beyond their own time. The focus shifted from the ledger to the community. Daniel and Victoria opened the corporate vaults not for more equipment, but for the next generation of healers. They launched the inaugural scholarship program on a Tuesday morning in the main auditorium. Hundreds of applicants sat in the rows, their notebooks open, waiting for a chance that had been denied to many before them. Victoria walked the stage, handing out the first of the grants. She watched a young student touch the document, his hands trembling as he realized his tuition was fully covered. This was the moment the numbers finally held weight. They poured their remaining profit into mentorship initiatives, turning their boardrooms into classrooms. One afternoon, a former scholarship recipient returned to the facility as a resident surgeon. He walked up to Daniel, shook his hand, and pointed to the patient he had just successfully treated. It was a cycle closing in real time. Daniel looked at the surgical team, then back at the young man, and finally understood the reach of their work. They were no longer just building clinics. They were building careers. The financial success had become a tool for social change, and for the first time in 30 years, the bank account stayed empty while the impact reports overflowed. They stood in the back of the ward, watching the rhythm of the hospital, realizing they had successfully passed the torch to a generation that would never know the struggle of that first empty room. The studio lights were low, casting a soft glare on the desk between Daniel and the interviewer. The journalist leaned forward, pen hovering over a notepad, and asked about the secret to their success. He wanted to know which decision had mattered the most across 3 decades. Daniel did not reach for the financial records or the maps showing their national reach. He closed his eyes for a second, pulling a memory from the back of his mind. He spoke of that first office, the one with the single desk, the cold operating table, and the silence that felt like a heavy weight. He remembered looking at the bare walls and seeing not the lack of resources, but the space to build something else. He told the reporter that they could have taken the easy path, the one that led to immediate profit and personal comfort. Instead, they chose to look toward the horizon. They spent their lives chasing a future they would only partially inhabit. Daniel looked around the quiet room, his hands resting flat on the table. There was no need for further explanation. The empire was not the legacy. The legacy was the act of choosing that direction when they had nothing to lose. He stood up, the interview finished, and walked toward the exit with a steady, measured pace. The drive to keep moving had finally turned into a stillness. He had reached the edge of the horizon, and it was enough.